Sometimes luck plays as big a part in sport as skill does. Lots of sportsmen and women all over the world having to rely on that little bit of luck to get where they want to be or to win their championships, matches or Olympic gold medals. In racing terms, the good luck moments are Hamilton and Verstappen for their respective first championships. They needed miracles and they got them. Colin Turkington in the 2019 BTCC season finale, where he was punted off in race 1 and had his championship rivals suffer brake failure in the final couple of laps. Then on top of that, you've got certain drivers just being in the right place at the right time. Jenson Button being one of them, with that Brawn having a double diffuser so good that by the time the other teams overtook Brawn, he was too far ahead. But what about the other drivers that suffer bad luck? Because I recently saw on the internet a post by, I think it was WTF1, where they asked if Charles Leclerc was the unluckiest driver ever, while responses to the post listed many other drivers who have been quite unfortunate with their careers, whether they never won anything, only won once or twice, or won stuff but often got let down for whatever reason. But this all depends on your definition, because bad luck could just mean bad career choices, or retiring from loads of races because of mechanical issues. The list goes on. So that means that today's video is a list video. I know I don't really enjoy doing these kinds of things, but I thought it would be just a little bit of fun. It is nearly Christmas after all, and I have actually got something planned for Christmas Day. I just need to record it, but anyway, these are 4 or 5, it's probably going to be 4 drivers who have had bad luck through their careers for whatever reasons and at varying levels. Now, some of these I might have mentioned before in other videos but omitted the exact statistics, probably because they weren't to hand. But it's interesting to just see everything as a listed number to see how many times it all went wrong for a particular driver, because sometimes you can lose something through absolutely no fault of your own. Car breaks down, somebody clangs into you, whatever. And also a little bit of housekeeping, if I listed every driver, this video would be like 2 hours long. This is just a sample. I don't know which drivers I'm going to use yet, I'm just going to go with the flow here, but one simple thing remains. If I haven't mentioned the driver you are thinking of, it doesn't mean I've forgotten, or I've deliberately missed out, or I'm hating on someone. They're just not part of the list. There's no need to get upset, because you just know it's going to happen. Maybe I've been doing this for far too long, but either way, I'm Simon for What Culture Wrestling, and here are a few racing drivers who have suffered bad luck for various reasons. Why? Here's why. First up, I've got Dale Earnhardt. Now, it took Dale 20 long years to win the Daytona 500, first attempting the iconic NASCAR race in 1979. Although, Dale has 7 NASCAR titles to his name, winning those in 1980, 86, 87, 90, 91, 93 and 94. In those 20 years, it had been a hard slog. His first 500 he'd been in, he was 8th, then 4th, then 5th. In 1996, he'd started on pole and finished 2nd, but looking at the stats, there are so many 3rd, 2nd, 4th, 5th place finishes, but only 1 win at Daytona, that coming in 1998. A statistic that seems odd given, as already mentioned, he won 7 titles in his career, and he'd won his first title in only his 2nd full season in the sport. While he'd won 30 races at Daytona over the course of that career, the 500 always eluded him. It's kind of like how Oscar Piastri won that sprint race, but it's not actually going to be a race win. He'd won like the qualifying races or the other races like the Chase or the Busch Classic or whatever it's called, but the actual main event, he didn't win. His exact stats before the 1998 season was something like 70 wins in 574 starts. Totally didn't read that off the screen, but how successful that is in NASCAR terms, I don't know. Someone will have to clarify it in the comments, but the point remains. He was always winning at Daytona, but that one 500 just, he couldn't get. It's a bit like having a multiple Formula 1 world champion who never won the Monaco Grand Prix. Or like Jim Clark. In 1997, Dale had been involved in a crash in the final 10 laps of the event, which resulted in the Intimidator being put in the back of an ambulance. When the Goodwrench Chevrolet was being towed, Dale had noticed that the tyres were still inflated. He got back in the car, which was just totally wrecked, and continued. He finished something like 31st, but it was just one of those things. But before 1997, if you could think of a way for him to lose the 500, he'd probably experienced it. In 1986, the engine blew with 3 laps left. In 1990, he cut a tyre with about a mile on the clock remaining. In 1991, he smacked a seagull at 200 miles an hour that knackered the radiator and slowed him down. In the 39 500s prior to 1998, 17 drivers had failed to win while leading with 10 to go. Earnhardt was on that list 4 times. Such was the meme of Dale not winning the Daytona 500, when the 1998 edition of the race entered the closing stages, Darrell Waltrip asked his spotter Jeff Hammond who was winning. The spotter simply said it was Dale, and Waltrip said, well, he ain't winning. On top of this, Dale might have felt that time was running out for him because he was getting older and there were new kids coming up and through into the big time, the most obvious of these being a certain Jeff Gordon. And Dale himself was a superstitious man. He believed that if you carried a $50 bill in your pocket, you weren't going to win a race. You were only going to get bad luck. Before the 1998 500, he'd met a little girl through the Make-A-Wish Foundation who had given him a penny, saying that it would give him good luck. Dale actually had this penny with him in the car when he was racing in that 1998 500, and he actually had some good fortune. There was a crash a little bit later on in the race with about 2 laps to go, 3 laps to go or something like that, so the yellow came out, and it meant that all Dale had to do was just drive the car over the finish line for what was possibly NASCAR's most popular victory of all time. And the thing actually went over on the caution. There was no last lap racing to the finish because back then the Daytona 500 was actually 500 miles. Yeah, exactly. It's actually mad though that the $50 bill thing also applied to Junior as well. In 2008, Dale Jr. was handed a $50 bill by Humpy Wheeler just before qualifying at the Lowe's Speedway. He qualified 39th while his teammates were in the top 10 and it started a slump that Junior attributes to that moment. Number 2 on the list, I've got Carlos Sainz. Senior, that is. Carlos Sainz Sr. is a 2-time World Rally Champion and the father of Carlos Sainz Jr. Sainz, known as El Matador, had won the World Rally Championship in 1990 and 1992 with Toyota, but after that never seemed to achieve the same lofty heights. In 1993 he'd gone to Lancia and finished 8th overall, and then moved to Subaru for 1994 only to finish 2nd behind Didier Auriol, who was driving for Toyota. In 1995, still at Subaru, Sainz was locked in a championship battle with his teammate Colin McRae. In a video I've done on the whole event, which I'll put up as a card if I remember, McRae had been leading the point standings by 5 points going into the Rally Catalunya, but the relationship between the two had been strained because of team orders applied at Sainz's home rally in Spain. The TLDR of it all is that Sainz was leading the rally and Dave Richards, the boss of Subaru at the time, said to Colin, "Don't race Carlos," because what Colin had a habit of doing was overdriving the car when he didn't need to and ending up wiping himself out of a rally or giving himself a mighty setback. So Subaru was trying to protect the 1-2, but Colin thought that this was favouring Carlos and things like that. So what ended up happening was Colin sort of eventually listened to the team orders. He basically gave himself a penalty so that Carlos would win the rally, but it meant that the two were going to be on equal points going to Colin's home rally at the Rally GB. I think I got all that right. During that rally, Colin got a puncture on stage 9 that cost him 2 minutes, and he also had to use a log to bend the suspension back to how it needed to be. Despite this, Colin decided to employ the if in doubt flat out strategy and drove like a man possessed, guided by Derek Ringer's pace notes, and he managed to somehow overhaul Sainz's lead, which looked impossible. Although, not sure how you'd consider this to be bad luck on Sainz's end, because you could say that Sainz didn't drive fast enough, or Colin was too good from stage 10 onwards. However, in 1998, Sainz probably should have won the title. Again, video on this has been done already. At one of the stages, again at the GB Rally, Tommy Mäkinen smacked his Lancer into a rock that wiped out the rear wheel. Undeterred, Tommy tried to drive the car to the service station up the road, but one of the local Rozzers had spotted this 3-wheeled Mitsubishi and said, "Look, I don't care if you're Tommy Mäkinen, this car is not roadworthy and I'm not letting you continue." And that was Mäkinen out of the rally, leaving Sainz with nothing to do but drive essentially, because McRae had also retired from the rally and that had put Sainz into the position he needed to take the title. But with about 200 metres left of the rally and the season, the Toyota Corolla that Sainz was driving that year crawled to a halt. Something had gone wrong with the engine. People think that they'd overboosted the engine because Sainz had slowed down and they were trying to sort of make the power back up again, but either way, they couldn't get the engine restarted and Sainz lost the title literally 200 metres from the finish. Mäkinen, meanwhile, was at the airport waiting for his flight back to Finland when he found out from his brother that Sainz had his car conk out. I mean, if I'd been called saying that, Sainz had broken down 200 metres from the finish, I'd be like, yeah, whatever. But that's how it happened. Mäkinen won the title. Then in 2001, Sainz had an outside shot of winning the championship, but it would have been hard work to do so. But at the 2001 Rally GB, I'm seeing a pattern emerging here, Mäkinen was out early, stage 2 I think it was. Then McRae went out. If Burns also dropped out, there would have been a chance, but it was going to take a miracle. He had to win the rally, really, but Gronholm was just too fast. But on one of the stages, Sainz slid wide and ended up barreling into a crowd of 13 people, after which Ford retired all of the cars. Nobody was seriously injured, by the way. The third title never came, but amazingly Sainz was still competitive. Outside of his season with Lancia, the 1999 and 2001 seasons, he was never outside of the top 4 between 1992 and 2004. But with all those seconds and thirds on that list, it's one of those what-ifs. Next up I've got Nicola Larini, which is kind of one of those out there choices for one of these kinds of videos really, because Nicola Larini was never a world beater, he was never a championship contender. He always seemed to be one of those dudes that just made up the rest of the numbers, but he did some really cool stuff in cars. In 1987, the Coloni team entered the final 2 European rounds of the season before making a full-on attempt at things in 1988. While Larini was unable to make the grid in the underpowered car at a power track, he was able to get on the grid for the Spanish Grand Prix, but had to retire early on. In 1988, he joined the Acela team and attracted a lot of attention because he was able to get the most out of an uncompetitive machine and ran 6th and in the points at San Marino before the car died on him. And then he'd put that same car in the top 10 for Japan. But all of this was dependent on whether the cars he was driving could actually get some funding. In 1990, he'd moved to Ligier, which was a team that was sort of alright, mid-grid, had some money, had some connections, had tobacco money, but the development of the car stagnated. He wouldn't score a single point, his best result being 7th twice, but he utterly destroyed his teammate. 1991, he moved to the Modena team, which kind of proves my previous point. That team had financial issues and Larini would only qualify for 5 races all year. But it was touring cars where he'd find success, winning the Italian touring car title in 1992 and then won DTM in 1993. In early 1994, Jean Alesi, a driver I've looked at as a whole in a dedicated video, was injured in testing, which was just a foreshadowing of what was to come over the course of the whole season, as both Alesi and JJ Leto suffered testing-related injuries. After impressing Ferrari through 1992 with testing the active suspension systems, Larini was called up to replace Alesi for the Pacific Grand Prix. His race would be over at the first corner as Häkkinen tagged Senna and then Larini had nowhere to go, wiping him and Senna out of the race. But Alesi was still injured and wouldn't be able to make the next Grand Prix, which was the start of the European season, so Larini had one more chance to impress. Larini would qualify in 6th for this race, 7/10 off his teammate Berger, who had put his Ferrari in 3rd. But during the race, Larini was able to make his way up the field and get himself onto the podium, and finish 2nd. But he wasn't able to celebrate. There was no champagne on the podium and he wasn't able to take in the fact that he'd scored his best ever result in Formula 1. There was just no way of enjoying the moment and basking in it because everybody's thoughts were elsewhere. Because that race was at Imola. So Larini went back to touring cars for a few years, but Alfa was starting to drop off the pace. But because of his Ferrari connections, he'd be back in Formula 1 in 1997, driving for Sauber. A single point would come at the Australian Grand Prix, but his relationship with Peter Sauber deteriorated, and he was gone from the sport after that year's Monaco Grand Prix. Number 4, but who's counting at this point? Andrea De Cesaris. 214 Grand Prix in the 80s and 90s was a lot, given that the seasons were about 16 races long as opposed to the 20 plus today. 200 races now is just shy of a 10-year career, so for a 214 race career back then, you had to be in for a long time. De Cesaris is also the epitome of a journeyman driver, 10 different teams in a 14-year career consisting of Alfa, McLaren, Ligier, Minardi, Brabham, Real, Scuderia Italia, Jordan, Tyrrell and Sauber, and he scored points at every single one of them with the exception of Minardi. Although often nicknamed De Crasherist for his penchant for having the car in a wall or inside another car, he holds 3 unwanted records. The most starts without a win, 208, and the record for the most consecutive non-finishes, 18 over the course of 1985 and 86. The third is the most non-finishes over a single season, which is 12 in 1987. While having the nickname De Crasherist, the vast majority of those DNFs in those periods mentioned were mechanical related. De Cesaris was also on course to score an unlikely win for the Jordan team in its very first season in the sport. At the Belgian Grand Prix of 1991, Andrea was running 2nd, and he was catching Senna's McLaren that was suffering from a gearbox issue, but the Jordan's engine went pop before he could get past and finish the race in the lead. probably the closest he ever came to a win, but he did score 5 podiums in his career. And that part about the 1991 Belgian Grand Prix is largely forgotten about today because of what the bloke in the other Jordan that day went on to achieve. That Jordan didn't make the first corner because the clutch got burned out, so Andrea going on to do what he did in that race, almost taking it to Senna, will just continue to go under the radar because of, well, it was Schumacher in the other car. But when things went right for De Cesaris, they went right. Some of the results standing out here: 3rd at the 1989 Canadian Grand Prix in a Scuderia Italia, 3rd at the 87 Belgian Grand Prix in a Brabham, and podiums in an Alfa Romeo. Points finishes in cars that weren't exactly great everywhere else. Would be interesting to see how many mechanical versus crashes he actually had. Turns out you can actually find these statistics on the internet. He had 147 retirements, but only 27 of those were a spin or some sort of impact with a car and/or wall. And the final one for today, even though I'm not really counting at this point, we've got Chris Amon, who is often regarded as the unluckiest of them all. Now, Jackie Stewart described the 1960s as being the time when sex was safe and racing was dangerous, and Chris Amon was part of that era, alongside the legends of Clark, Hill, Gurney, Brabham, and others. The Kiwi was handpicked by Enzo Ferrari to drive for him, and he and Bruce McLaren had won Le Mans in 1966, which was the catalyst for that invitation to drive for the Prancing Horse. Despite his Formula 1 failings, Amon would be pretty successful in sports cars. By the time the 1967 Formula 1 season had started, he was already a Daytona 24 winner and also a 1,000 km winner at Monza, that being with Lorenzo Bandini. Remember that Amon is driving at the time when motorsport was at its most dangerous. Well, going into 1968 it definitely was. Many of his contemporaries across all categories would be losing lives left, right and centre, among those being Bandini, who was killed at the 1967 Monaco Grand Prix, and Jim Clark, who would be killed at Hockenheim the following year. Amon would be mentioned in the same breath as the likes of Clark, Stewart, Hill and Brabham, but it seemed that no matter what he did, he'd never be able to stand on the top step of a Formula 1 podium. He'd have 6 podiums in 3 years with Ferrari, and even Jackie Ickx would say that Amon was faster than him. With no success at Ferrari, Amon shifted to March, where he'd get 3 podiums but once again no win. But while most of the Ferrari retirements in 1969 had been engine related, in 1970 Ferrari had now got Fiat money and the engine became one of the best of the 70s. Amon would lose several races through mechanical issues. How many races he retired from the lead I've yet to find, but it was one of those things where he just could not catch a break. And he also holds the record for the most amount of teams driven for in a Formula 1 career. 13, which is a lot. 13 teams and no win, despite being highly rated and respected by his contemporaries. His bad luck was so widely known in motorsport that Mario Andretti once quipped that if he'd become an Undertaker, people would stop dying. But Amon never thought himself to be unlucky, because he'd managed to survive up until 2016 when he died of cancer aged 73. He said in an interview that he was lucky. Jimmy, Lorenzo, Bruce, Jochen, Scarfiotti, Siffert, Courage, they were the unlucky ones in his opinion. There were others, guys who were my friends, people I raced with. I had several big accidents that could have killed me. I broke ribs, but I was never badly hurt. Jimmy never drew blood until Hockenheim. Rindt rarely hurt himself. All it takes is one crash. Which actually puts all of that into some sort of weird perspective, really. Amon survived where many of his mates didn't, and I'm sure Jackie Stewart would say exactly the same thing. It's that thing of, what do you consider to be lucky or unlucky? I kind of mentioned this at the top of the video, but knowing what I know about the 1960s, I think I'd rather be alive than never win a race. So then, a look at 5 drivers who could be considered unlucky for various reasons. There's probably a whole load of others, but I won't take too much of your time up. But if you enjoyed this video, then do give it a like if you've learned something or been given food for thought. If there are other drivers that you can think of, do leave them in the comments and get some discussions going. And while scrolling down, if you haven't already, like the video and get that bell on for any future content. Massive thanks to the rad lads at Patreon, and if you want to support me on a more personal level, all the links are in the description. So Patreon, socials, Discord and affiliates. Or the super thanks and memberships for other methods of supportage. So until next time, I've been Millward. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.